Welcome back everyone to Formula 1 2020, round 10 of the season. Welcome to your race review for the Russian Grand Prix. Today's race at Sochi, I believe, is one of the best we have ever seen at the Russian Grand Prix. It's not a circuit we're used to plenty of overtakes, plenty of dramas, but actually we saw quite a bit of both today, especially on lap 1. The fight in the midfield, as always, fantastic. Drivers' Championship up and down the grid completely thrown into disarray today. So, spoiler warning ahead as always. I hope you enjoyed today's review, but before we jump into today's results, this was your grid for the Russian Grand Prix. After a scare in Q2 with red flag caused by Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton just nipped through and eventually went on to claim pole position for the 94th time in his career. Max Verstappen, a late, incredible lap, put him on the front row. Bottas, P3, won the race from P3 all the way back in 2017 for his first ever race victory. Perez, Ricciardo, 4th and 5th. Sainz, Ocon, Norris, Gasly and Charles Leclerc, your top 10. Leclerc, his own tyre choice. Alex Albon, who qualified 10th, a 5-place grid penalty, along with Nicholas Latifi for engine changes. That meant Danny Kvyat started P11, the home hero, alongside Lance Stroll in P12. Russell alongside Sebastian Vettel on row 7. Row 8, Alex Albon with that penalty alongside Romain Grosjean. Giovinazzi, Magnussen, Raikkonen and Latifi, your top 20. Spoiler warnings out of the way. Here is your result for the 2020 Russian Grand Prix. And for the second time this season, Valtteri Bottas victorious here in Russia. His second ever victory here at Sochi. Fastest lap as well, 26 points. Lewis Hamilton all the way down in 3rd. Max Verstappen splitting the two Mercedes cars. It was a victory gifted to Valtteri Bottas, but we'll jump onto that in a moment's time, talk about why the penalties was dished out, not one but 2 penalties for Lewis Hamilton, and a difficult fight back through the field, something we're not so used to with regard to Lewis Hamilton. Sergio Perez, P4, a great drive from the Mexican driver, comfortably in front of P5 Daniel Ricciardo, who had a very tasty Grand Prix indeed. Charles Leclerc, once again continuing that consistency we have seen throughout 2020. A great drive from him to pick up 8 points, P6. Ocon 7th, more points for Danny Kvyat and P8. Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon, your final points scorers. Antonio Giovinazzi, his best race of the season. A great job from Gio. Just missed out on points, P11 for the Italian driver. Kevin Magnussen, a quiet day but a solid drive from the Dane to beat Sebastian Vettel in 13th. Kimi Raikkonen 14th. Norris tried his best to hold on to points, but just in the closing stages had to do a late pit stop fighting Alex Albon. P15 for him. Latifi P16, Grosjean 17, George Russell in P18. Your final finisher, Lance Stroll and Carlos Sainz did not finish. And that's your result from today's Grand Prix. And today's race debrief, today's race rundown. I think we'll start with Sainz, with Lance Stroll, those opening lap incidents, and then work our way forward. So we'll start with the bottom from that timetable on the left and work our way to the top. And what a crazy opening, not only opening lap to today's Grand Prix, but opening half of the race I thought was really, really fun. Lots of strategy intrigue. We had Hamilton's penalty. We had the crazy incidents that seemed to be all the way scattered through the field, through turn 1, through lap 1. We had, first of all, into turn 1, Max Verstappen bogged down. Not massively, but as expected on that dirty side of the grid. Bottas fighting with Lewis Hamilton up at the front. Further back in that mid-pack, most of the cars going 4 or 5 wide. Carlos Sainz, a lovely dive bomb up the inside of a few cars in front of his teammate, in front of Pierre Gasly. Sadly, then overcooked it a little bit too much, had to run wide through the bollards, and I suppose very much unlike Carlos Sainz, very uncharacteristic error, hit the wall when trying to rejoin the circuit. A very, very strange incident. Flew back across the circuit, didn't collect any cars, which was brilliant, but Lando Norris, gutted for him, all the way through, all the debris, sent all the way to the back of the field, and whereas McLaren knew they were coming to a circuit which wouldn't be their best. All that hard work done in qualifying out of the window straight away. Only a couple of corners later, exit of turn 3 through turn 4, a little bit of contact between the racing point of Lance Stroll and Charles Leclerc sent Stroll spinning round into the wall. Safety car out on lap 1. We then, as a result, saw Norris, that we just mentioned, Alex Albon and George Russell try something a little bit different, all going into the pit lane, all strapping on the hard tyres, and what a fight we saw between those three. Russell finished 18th at the end of the Grand Prix. Lando Norris just a couple of positions up the road in P15. Albon just sneaking into the points, but the fight we saw between all three of those drivers was absolutely lovely. We saw them through lockdown during the virtual GPs. We saw them in Formula 2 a couple of years ago. And this was the first time. We've seen Norris and Albon go wheel to wheel a couple of times. We've seen Russell and Norris a couple of times. But all three of them on pace, fighting for position, was really, really awesome to see. Probably the best fight we saw throughout the entire Grand Prix. And all three of them trying to make overtakes in places you just wouldn't expect to see at Sochi. We also saw something in the second phase of the race with Norris, Albon and Gasly, which was almost as good. Gasly really hounding down Albon, who was really hounding down Norris. But just that fight at the beginning, the relationship the three have of Russell, Norris and Albon, seeing that on track, fighting it out was really, really awesome. I can't deny. But what we did see in those opening stages was that overtaking here was possible, which is something we don't normally say at Sochi. But if you made a move, you had to make it quick and make it stick. Several drivers getting caught behind slower cars, especially the Renaults, but also George Russell, the majority of his race, really hurt by being stuck behind his teammate. And that fight he did get involved with Lando and Alex. A little bit of a lock-up, forced him on a really, really awful two-stop strategy. Didn't do him any favours. 1 point in front, Romain Grosjean had an okay race for the majority of it, right behind K-Mag. The two Haas drivers pretty much neck and neck. Magnussen was always in front of Grosjean, but they were both about 1 second, 2 seconds between each other, hoping they could cling on and just, if there was some kind of issue up ahead, snatch a point. And whereas K-Mag finished P12, was just able to fend off Vettel, Raikkonen and Norris, Grosjean had a bit of a ding-dong with Sebastian. Bit of contact between the two of them. Grosjean into the polystyrene barriers. Had to do an extra stop. Didn't need to do that really, but the team trying something a little bit different in the closing stages. Ending P17. They tried something, but just like we often say with those backmarker cars, you've got to have a virtually clean weekend and hope for something crazy go on up ahead to score points. Grosjean, an okay race, but nothing spectacular. Nicholas Latifi, a kind of a similar story to Grosjean really, but Latifi's race I think was just a little bit quieter. Was able to hold off his teammate George Russell, had a great fight with Kimi Raikkonen, but apart from that, he's just doing what he's been doing all season really, being consistent, not getting into silly accidents during the Grand Prix, crashed into the barriers in practice, but not bad from Nicholas Latifi. Norris, we kind of mentioned with George Russell. His teammate, of course, out on lap 1, involved in just trying to get out of the way of the sprawling debris of Carlos Sainz's McLaren on lap 1. Had to do a stop pretty much straight away after that incident. Fighting with Albon and Gasly later on, had a few late lockups, had to do a pit stop, maybe trying to go for fastest lap. Either way, not the results or race McLaren would have wanted at all. Kimi Raikkonen and Sebastian Vettel, these two, inseparable, it seems, in 2020. And once again, they have finished right next to each other on the road, fighting for a good chunk of that Grand Prix. And whereas Raikkonen had a quiet race, fighting with Vettel, fighting with Latifi, nowhere near the points really. Went really long, actually, on his first set of tyres. But apart from that, a quiet day for Kimi. Sebastian, though in pure pace it wasn't a brilliant Grand Prix, did wonders for teammate Charles Leclerc, and it's why you'll see a little bit later on Driver of the Day, I'm not so lenient with Charles and Driver of the Day today, because I think his result is more of Sebastian Vettel's heroics, holding up the two Renaults, especially Esteban Ocon. Really good drive from Sebastian Vettel today in that aspect, but the pace just once again, for some reason, not there for Seb. K-Mag, I mentioned a little bit earlier on, but we might as well mention Kevin and Giovinazzi because both of them just really, really consistent today. Both of them with subpar machinery, beating the likes of Sebastian Vettel, Lando Norris, and of course helped by Stroll and Sainz not finishing. But Giovinazzi and Kevin Magnussen, to be fair to them, both of them on a real bad string of form. So for both of them, that's a big result. Magnussen, who's getting very used to DNF in this season, to get a P12, he'll be happy with that indeed. And Giovinazzi, all of this talk with Mick Schumacher once again having a great weekend in F2, to score a P11, one off the points, great drive from Antonio today. Our top 10 then. I might go through team by team actually. That's probably a better way of doing it with our top 10. We'll start with AlphaTauri, because we had a real mixed bag from these two. Pierre Gasly 9th, Danny Kvyat P8. Gasly qualified inside the top 10 once again. Danny Kvyat started 11th on the alternate strategy. Early on, Gasly having a really, really strong race, mixing it up with the Renaults, with Sergio Perez, looking like maybe could, if things went his way, get a top 5 finish. And whilst that didn't really play out in the long term, and a late pit stop from Gasly, a 2-stop strategy, had it all to do with a few laps to go, he had a great little final few laps to overtake Lando Norris, Alex Albon, nicked fastest lap for a moment, but ultimately that was taken away by Valtteri Bottas. Strong drive once again from Gasly. We're so used to that in 2020. But Danny Kvyat, home Grand Prix, home hero. I thought he was brilliant today. I really, really do. Made some fantastic overtakes. Was really, really feisty in his moves. Trying to always move forward. Did get stuck behind Esteban Ocon. And if he'd have got past Ocon and maybe hunted down Leclerc, would definitely have been my driver of the day. But that's held him back a little bit in my shout for that. But Kvyat, another driver, under pressure to perform at the moment. Home Grand Prix, it's one that he's not usually does fantastic at, but a really strong drive from Danny Kvyat. Like Kimi Raikkonen, went really, really long with the strategy, really paid off for the Russian today. Leclerc, we'll mention him and then we'll talk about Renault. A quiet race from Charles, but it's what we've seen all the way through 2020. Consistently better than his teammates. Consistently not making mistakes that we saw quite a bit of last season from Charles Leclerc. Outperforming the car. Helped by Sebastian Vettel with the strategy, but a huge haul of points. And still, despite being in that terrible Ferrari, is in the mix for 4th in the standings. Ridiculous. But splitting the two Renaults, they certainly wouldn't have expected that. But Renault themselves, I think, will be kicking themselves. It's a 5th for Daniel Ricciardo. He's really surprising me. Not only this season, but again in the driver's standings. Well and truly in that mix for 4th place. Esteban Ocon P6. I think a little bit of a strategy blunder on this one. Ocon, brilliant in the opening few laps. Really nice and dicey, gutsy on that move with Ricciardo on the first lap before the safety car came out. On the restart, I wasn't sure if Ocon was going to be able to really challenge Max Verstappen and reignite that rivalry from a couple of years ago. Didn't play out that way. Maybe then when I thought Perez would catch up with Ocon, I thought, oh my goodness me, it's one of those days for Esteban Ocon. But no, undercut from Sergio Perez thanks to Ocon getting stuck behind Sebastian Vettel. Really, really not only hurt his race, but also Daniel Ricciardo's, because when Ocon slowed down to let Ricciardo through to give Ricciardo a chance at Sebastian Vettel, Ricciardo, very, very mature, very rare you see this, owned up to his mistake, locking up into turn 2, going wide, getting a 5-second penalty for cutting the corner. I can't help but think it wasn't the best place for Ocon to get out of the way, but none of us as fans or viewers or even media are privy to know when the call was made for Ocon to get out of the way. And if it was late down the main straight, it was messy, I think is the best way of putting it. Ricciardo, though, great that he owned up for his penalty again. Very, very rare you see that, not just in Formula 1, but all sport in general. Told the team, look, I'm just going to knuckle down. I'm going to put in these laps. I'm going to claw back this time. It's exactly what he did. P5, another great result for the Aussie. But beating out Ricciardo for P4, Sergio Perez, Mr. Consistent. He must have a drive next season. He really must. What a stunning performance today. Not only his move on Daniel Ricciardo at the inside of turn 3, not only his general pace in today's Grand Prix, but the fact he was 10 seconds behind Lewis Hamilton, I think is very, very impressive. And yes, Hamilton had his own issues today, but I think Sergio, without the upgrades on that racing point, the way he controlled that midfield so much today, massively impressive. Surely he's going to be on the grid next season. I'm convinced. He must be, because, again, today, faultless from Checo. Mercedes or Red Bull then, they're the two teams left. I think we'll talk about Red Bull. Max Verstappen, what can we really say about Max Verstappen? A little bit like Perez, actually. A faultless drive from Max. No mistakes, getting the maximum out of that car. Should he have been second place? On pace of the car, no. Mercedes clearly are the best at this particular circuit. And I'm not talking a little bit better than Red Bull. Comfortably, this is a Mercedes circuit. So the fact he was able to stay in front of Hamilton by a lovely margin, but also just finish 5 seconds behind Valtteri Bottas, is a really, really strong drive from Max Verstappen. But for him, probably in the cockpit, quite a boring Grand Prix. His teammate, though, a real mixed bag from Alex Albon, because he had some great fights. He made some awesome overtakes, some magical scraps with the group we mentioned earlier on, and fighting his way back through the field. Had engine issues yesterday, so already was on the back foot starting 10th. Then today, caught up in that opening lap shenanigans, had to stop on lap 1, made a 2-stop strategy work. All of that, pretty awesome. Fine. 1 point though, just that little bit of consistency he's missing. And if this was a one-off race this season, I think I'd be a little bit more lenient, but it's happened multiple times this year. Not a bad race at all from Alex, but the result certainly isn't great. And I just wondered whether that momentum from the Tuscan Grand Prix Mugello would carry forward. Sadly, it hasn't. But he's got a new engine. You'd like to think there's going to be no more penalties. Hopefully he can knuckle down for the remaining 7 races? 8 races? Anyway, hopefully he can knuckle down for the rest of the season. And finally, Mercedes. Straightforward for Valtteri Bottas. Handed on a silver platter is a little bit harsh, considering the fact he was faultless today. His pace was really, really good, fighting with Hamilton into turn 1, but certainly the threat for Max Verstappen was never really going to come. And Lewis Hamilton, a strange one, a real strange one, 2 penalties. It's harsh. It is harsh from the FIA. Unprecedented, that's for sure, but going past the red light at the end of the pit lane, trying something different. He said, I think on the team radio, he wanted to get away from the marbles that were in the pit lane and just do his practice starts away from everyone else. It's just a strange thing to do. It's just such an extraordinary thing to happen in Formula 1. And we've seen Hamilton get involved in a couple of these incidents now this season. He's on 10 penalty points, 2 away from a race ban. Still managed to claw his way back to P3. He's not happy. You can understand why he's not happy with the penalties given there. And it's a slightly sloppy mistake from Mercedes, a little bit like we saw in Monza. They're the kind of team you don't expect to make these kind of mistakes. But 2 times in 3 races, Hamilton, he'll be fine. Still comfortably in the lead of the standings. But maybe this will shift momentum a little bit more to Bottas's end. We're going to have to wait and see. Before we jump into Driver of the Day, race rating and our Formula 2 report, this is what your drivers and team standings looks like after round 10 at the Russian Grand Prix. And as you can see, Lewis Hamilton's lead at the top of the standings reduced slightly, 44 points now between the Mercedes pair. Max Verstappen still third, but not really in that championship hunt anymore. The fight for P4 though, that's the one to keep your eye on. Lando Norris, 65 points, 1 point back is Alex Albon, 1 point further back, Daniel Ricciardo. It's then Leclerc and Stroll on 57 each. Sergio Perez is then only 1 point behind those two in 9th place, and Pierre Gasly just holding on in P10. That fight for 4th, 65 points, all the way down to Perez on 56, 9 points separating 4th to 9th. Awesome. Absolutely loving that fight this season. Carlos Sainz, another non-finish here this weekend, leaves him in P11. Ocon closing him down just 5 points behind the McLaren driver. Sebastian Vettel P13, Danny Kvyat P14, and no changes for Hülkenberg, Raikkonen, Giovinazzi, Kevin Magnussen, Nicholas Latifi, George Russell and Romain Grosjean. Your team's championship is all the same, but the gap's much closer after today's Grand Prix. Mercedes 366 continuing to run away with it. Red Bull comfortably in P2, 192 points, but once again the fight for best of the rest. McLaren currently leading in third, 106 points. Renault just 7 points behind them, but splitting McLaren and Renault racing points. Goodness me, keep your eye on that battle as the season goes on. Ferrari just edging that gap out a little bit over AlphaTauri in 6th and 7th. Alfa Romeo on 4, Haas on 1, Williams yet to score. Before we jump into race rating and driver of the day, this is your Formula 2 report for the Russian Grand Prix. With Yuki Tsunoda on pole position for the Formula 2 feature race for the Russian Grand Prix weekend, Mick Schumacher had a lot to do to make sure his championship lead stayed untouched. A great drive from the German driver put him in pole position for race victory, and that's exactly what he did. His second ever feature race victory. Yuki Tsunoda held on to P2, championship protagonist Callum Ilott P3. Giotto, Daruvala, Aitken, Mazepin, Guan Yu Zhou, Marcus Armstrong and Dan Ticktum, your top 10 scoring points in the feature race. Guan Yu Zhou on reverse grid pole. What could he do in the sprint race? Could the Chinese driver get his first ever Formula 2 victory? He did exactly that. P1 for Guan Yu Zhou. However, it wasn't quite straightforward. Only 5 laps completed in the sprint race. A huge incident between Jack Aitken and Luca Giotto brought out the red flags. Race stopped early. Half points awarded. Aitken and Giotto keep their places in 4th and 5th. Mazepin and Schumacher on the podium. Tsunoda, Ilott and Ticktum scoring. Piquet and Schwartzman the top 10. My driver of the weekend, Mick Schumacher, first in the feature race, third in the sprint race. And just with 2 more weekends to go, Mick Schumacher comfortably leads over Callum Ilott. Yuki Tsunoda a little bit closer after a strong weekend on 147 points. Lundgaard and Schwartzman, your top 5. And finally, before we go, it's time for driver of the day and race rating. Yesterday, I gave my qualifying DOTD to George Russell. A magic lap sent the British driver through to Q2, but struggled in the Grand Prix. My race driver of the days, I've got to give it to Sergio Perez. Max Verstappen had a great drive, Giovinazzi, Kevin Magnussen, Valtteri Bottas, but my P2 I've given to Danny Kvyat. But my overall driver of the weekend, second yesterday, second today, Max Verstappen, continuing to get the most out of that Red Bull. Faultless drive today and yesterday from the Flying Dutchman. And my race rating, I really did enjoy that race today. I know a lot of people aren't big fans of Sochi, but I think this season, when you look back to races like Spain, Hungary, today was certainly better than that. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. And probably the best race we have ever seen at Sochi. Just to add as kind of like a little asterisk side note along with the race rating. And that is your lot here for the 2020 Round 10 Russian Grand Prix race review. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time for the Nürburgring Eifel German Grand Prix. I cannot wait for that one. But if you are new, I hope you enjoyed today's race review. Hope you enjoyed today's race weekend. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.